Consider, if you will, the Mona Lisa. Created in the early 1500s, it is one of, if not the most, famous painting in the history of the world. But unless you're very lucky, if you want to experience the Mona Lisa in her full glory, you're gonna need to get on a plane and fly to the Louvre in Paris. It's not exactly an easy piece of media to experience. Valued at something like $1 billion, it's also not exactly easy to acquire. And then, finally, when you rest your eyes on her mysterious smile, you, like many others, might actually be disappointed. Lovingly rendered on a piece of white poplar only 30 inches tall by 21 inches wide, it would be difficult for the Mona Lisa to measure up to her fame. By now, you've probably seen bigger, more colorful paintings with more clarity, more realistic lighting, and a more interesting pose. In fact, many of today's paintings are digital, made on a canvas that if printed to scale would be 100 feet tall. By comparison, the Mona Lisa is small, drab, and worst of all, boring. The reviews are in. The kids are calling it mid, and they're also calling me unk. I don't know what that means. But because of its lower resolution graphics and the relatively simple techniques of its creation, is it less meaningful and less enjoyable? Does the Mona Lisa need a remake? This isn't a great metaphor because thanks to cameras, you can experience the Mona Lisa in pretty close to its original form. Almost like you're emulating the viewing experience, but let's pretend that the Louvre made it illegal for you to own or view copies of the Mona Lisa, because of course they own it and they want to charge you to experience it. This isn't intended to be a conversation around emulation, so we won't talk about what happens if they put the painting in storage and just say you're not allowed to see it ever again. It is intended to be a conversation about remakes, and to be perfectly clear, I don't really care for remakes or remasters, but unless they're used as an excuse to remove a previously accessible version of a game, like what happened with the Yakuza 0 Director's Cut, I typically just don't play them. If I had to pick a side on the debate of should games be remade, I'd say that the older versions should be accessible on modern hardware, but I'm a little too cynical to expect that kind of mentality from most companies. Anyway, I'm much more interested in the conversation around these games and the psychology of how the way we experience them changes over time. One very common sentiment used to support the idea of a remake is that even if you could acquire these older games, they are less enjoyable because they're old. They've aged poorly. And I think that this is unfair to the games. Is a game less fun because it's old? And because the question is rhetorical, I'll provide the answer, which is no, and I'll also add on, that's silly. Saying that a piece of art or a video game or a movie has aged poorly is an inherently silly statement, because by the nature of them being static, they don't really age. Art doesn't change with the exception of the march of time on the medium that contains the media, like the paint on the Mona Lisa becoming more faded over time, or the scratches my Xbox 360 put on 5 copies of Oblivion, you son of a... We change. The audience is aging. Some of us quite poorly. But a silent film is the exact same as it ever was, though its content may not be as relevant or our interpretations of it in our modern society may be different. The works of Homer and Shakespeare haven't aged. Language has changed around them. Just in the same way that tank controls in the original Resident Evils haven't aged. It's our expectation of how controls work in games, how quickly things respond, how lighting should look, how inventories are managed. Our expectations of those things are different because of our experiences. If you showed the original Silent Hill to someone who had no concept of a video game right now, would they tell you, the fixed camera is outdated, it should be over the shoulder instead? No, that's silly. And for most players, I believe the question being asked isn't really, are fixed camera angles better than an over-the-shoulder camera? But instead it's, how similar is this game to what I'm used to? And that's a very different question, and I think that is one part of what makes the remake discourse so heated. Some of my earliest memories are watching my mom playing The Legend of Zelda on the original NES or Famicom, depending on where you live. My first game was probably the original Super Mario Bros. That came with Duck Hunt. And I got to slowly evolve my digital literacy in line with the technological advances of gaming. I had the chance to learn how to use a controller back when they only had a D-pad and 4 buttons, and I only had to manage spatial awareness in 2 dimensions. Slowly, more buttons and joysticks were added, and appropriately, the amount of possible stuff those buttons could do were also able to expand. At the same time, developers were experimenting with countless different ways to present and interact with games, but I wasn't overwhelmed by those changes because I had years to get used to them, and I didn't have many other games to play, so I was willing to put in the effort to learn them. Each time I did that, it reinforced to my brain that I could do that. I know that I can get used to awkward controls, I know that I can overcome difficult enemies, and I know that games with lower fidelity and clunky design can still be enjoyable to experience and rewarding to complete because I've done all of those things many, many times. I've had over 30 years of steady change and practice to expand my gaming vocabulary. But if I compare that to modern gaming, where the majority of game mechanics and input systems have coalesced into what the industry considers popular or best practices, I can kind of see how newer players would have difficulty getting hooked into some of these older experiences. They are different in countless little ways that cause a huge amount of mental friction because the modern gamer does not yet speak the language. And if we're being honest, I think it might be harder to learn the language of these games for a new player today, specifically because genre and input convention has become so codified. I promise I'm not trying to make excuses for remakes, but just hear me out. If you started playing games in 2015 and you were playing a modern game, what were you playing? The Witcher 3, Fallout 4, Metal Gear Solid 5, and Bloodborne. That's right, Grandpa, it's been over 10 years. For comparison, between 1995 and 2005, we went from Chrono Trigger and Donkey Kong Country 2 to Resident Evil 4 and God of War. The way we interact with games has stagnated, and I think that one consequence of that is that someone who's only been playing games for literally a decade has only had to really internalize one way that they look and one way to interact with them, so when they do encounter something new, not only is it not what they're used to, they may be at an actual disadvantage in their ability to adapt because they have not yet learned how to be flexible in the way that they engage with games and how they enjoy them. Again, that's not to make excuses for those players. They've got soft hands, and they can choose to change that or not, but the point of all this is that just because a game is different doesn't mean there's something wrong with the game. And to be perfectly clear, I'm not immune to this mental friction either. There are mountains of games that I cannot bring myself to enjoy, but what I'm trying to keep in mind is that it's not the fault of the game. It's because the ridges and bumps of my ever-changing human skeleton brain aren't currently aligned to the never-changing ridges and bumps of the media. A remake does not fix that. It's a retelling, an adaptation of the existing work with a varying level of adherence to its source material. Whether the remake is better or worse than the original is kind of a moot point because fundamentally you're comparing different games. even if the stories and characters are similar or completely the same. Okay, so keeping all that in mind, who is a remake for? I think there are two primary categories of players who want a remake: the new player and the replayer. The new player wants to experience a classic game in a way that has less friction, and I do sympathize with that, even if the knee-jerk response is get good. There's a certain level of real gamer clout that comes around having experienced the early days of the medium, and it lets you feel like you're allowed at the grown-ups table of video game discourse. That's one of the reasons I play through a lot of older games and talk about them on this channel. I didn't actually get to play them as a kid, and now it feels like I haven't done my homework when I'm talking about modern games. What I think is key to remember for those players is that a remake is by definition a different experience, like watching the movie instead of reading the book. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. If you liked the movie, then maybe you'll enjoy the book too. Maybe even more than the movie once you get over the initial differences. I always assumed that the majority of players who wanted a remake were younger gamers who didn't have the chance to play them at release. And after laying my own bias onto a study by marketing research firm MTM, I might be onto something. I'm not going to put my personal info into this form to see the full study, but the meaningful stats that I found say that out of 1,500 respondents across the US and UK, 90% had played a remake or a remaster in the last year, and 85% of those had never played the original version of the game that they had played. And I think that's really interesting because it shows that there is this desire to experience these games. What that study doesn't really take into account, as far as I can tell, is how easily available those original versions are to most players. If you really wanted to play Final Fantasy VII, that's everywhere, but if you want to play Silent Hill 2, that's a little trickier. The replayer faces a much more complicated issue. That same summary from the MTM report claimed that remakes help them reconnect with positive, comforting feelings and memories that they had when they first played the game. They want to feel about the game the way they felt when they first played it, to rediscover it and approach that classic game with the same sense of wonder and mystery that they had when they were younger. And again, this seems really unfair to the game. For obvious reasons, we can't just wipe our memories and experience a game again for the first time, but starting a new game, parsing the lore of a new world, learning new mechanics, it can be exhausting, and you're not even sure if you'll like the game. You want something that's sort of like what you're already used to, and hey, wait, does that sound familiar? How similar is this game to what I'm used to? I get it though. When you're stuck in a rut and sick of your comfort game but not ready for something new, I can see how a remake would kind of fill that need. Again, I don't think there's anything wrong with that, but I do think it's sort of self-medicating the symptoms of a bigger problem, one that I'm not really qualified to help with, and I'd be lying if I said I don't struggle with a lot of those same feelings too. But it does feel a little icky when I think about it from that perspective, because where there's need, there is greed. Up until this point, I've been focusing on the value and reasoning of a remake from the perspective of the consumer, but when we start to think about nostalgia, it turns our attention dangerously close to the elephant in the room of the remake conversation, which is, why does a company want a remake? And of course, the answer is money. It's not a problem that's unique to games either. I feel like I've been hearing that Hollywood is out of new ideas for decades. But when do you think that started? Was it around the time you hit 20, or do you think that's when you started noticing? You know The Wizard of Oz? It's a classic, right? 1939, Judy Garland, the original Tin Man, was in the hospital for 2 weeks after his lungs failed because the silver paint was toxic. Did you know it's not the first film adaptation of the book? I didn't until I was writing this script. There was a silent black and white version from Canada that came out in 1925. The one that I grew up with was technically a remake. Every generation gets the same stories repackaged with different levels of adherence to the source material. Video games are just the newest storytelling medium, and telling stories is expensive. I have no doubt that the vast majority of people who work in games do it because they love games deeply, but a company is not its people, and no matter how good a company is, it kind of has to exist, at least in some capacity, for profit, because without profit, you don't get to have a company anymore. A summarized version of the cynical take is that the games industry has also run out of good ideas, and they're just remaking the old ones that were popular. But I don't think that's true. Not to defend companies, but ideas are a dime a dozen. Making games is hard though, and it carries a lot of risk. A remake takes a lot of that pressure off by virtue of name recognition. As part of the Microsoft-Activision merger, there was a report released that claimed that some AAA game publishers expect to spend an equal amount of the development budget of a game again on marketing alone, with one specifically saying the development costs for a single project had reached nearly $600 million, and marketing for that project alone was expected to go to at least $550 million more. But you can spend a lot less when people already know and, more importantly, like what you're selling. Unfortunately, remakes actually sell pretty well. According to data collected by Ampere Analysis between 2024 and 2025, remakes and remasters together had over 72 million players across Xbox, PlayStation, and Steam. Now, that number could be misleading since many of those games are available through Game Pass and PlayStation Plus respectively. I'm not sure if these numbers accounted for free players or just people who actually bought the games, but it reports that those players spent over $1.4 billion on the games themselves and in-game purchases in that time. But what I found really interesting from that report is that it's not enough for the games to just get a fresh coat of paint. Now, I don't have the full data set to know how much this was affected by the initial price of the game to the player. Remasters are often less expensive than full remakes, but overall, customers spent 2.2 times as much on remakes compared to remasters, and that includes Oblivion in the remaster category, which was the biggest spend by far. So what that tells me is that in general, the new version can't just be shinier. A remaster might appeal to the existing fans, but to catch a new audience, it needs to feel different too, and so we come back to the same point. Remakes are not replacements, they are different games. And that's fine. They aren't for me, and they don't have to be. Some of these remakes are genuinely fantastic and stand on their own regardless of their namesakes. That's great. More good games isn't a bad thing, but no matter how good those games are, they don't replace the originals, and by extension, they aren't bringing that classic game to a modern audience. They are using familiar stories and imagery to sell us a new product. Sometimes you're getting the Peter Jackson movies, and sometimes you're getting the Gollum game, but you're never getting the books. Maybe that classic game was considered bad when it released, and sometimes it could just be a bad fit for what the player wants at the current moment. But it's not too old. It just is what it is, and maybe one day you'll want what it is again. And it'll still be there, exactly the same as it always was. At least if the preservationists have anything to say about it. But to bring this all back to the start, I don't think viewing the Mona Lisa is going to be a meaningful experience for every viewer, but I also don't think the Mona Lisa needs to be. It doesn't need mass appeal, and it doesn't need a remake either, but in a perfect world, everyone should be able to experience it for themselves and decide if they like it. Take care of yourself, and as always, thanks for watching. Later. Hey, it's the after the video part, so now I can tell you that I was not aware until I went looking for stock video of the Mona Lisa that there actually is a video game remake of the painting. It was created by the Louvre and it's a VR game called Mona Lisa Beyond the Glass. It's free if you want to check that out, and I think it's especially interesting for this conversation because it doesn't really fit into any of the molds that I mentioned. I doubt someone who wanted to see the Mona Lisa for the first time would want to do that in VR. The people who had seen it before probably don't really care to experience it that way, and the company that owns it isn't making any money off the app. It's in this weird, separate education category with those Assassin's Creed game modes where you can walk around Egypt and learn history. I love the idea that it exists, but I couldn't figure out how to fit it into the script because it's remaking a work from a different medium into a video game, which is like calling The Last of Us a remake of The Road. As a remake, it was clearly created with a deep respect for the original work, but it's not preserving it. It's a totally different experience in a different medium, made by different people 500 years after the original, and I don't think anyone could pretend it's a replacement for seeing the painting, but I also don't think it was ever intended to be. It's supplemental to the experience, and that's interesting, but I don't know how we would ever get to that point with remakes of existing video games. It would take reframing our concept of a game into a lens with which to view a world and story, but that's hard to do when the original versions keep being delisted or ignored by the companies that own them. I don't know. It's food for thought. Anyway, thanks for hanging out with me. Later.